Hello, everybody. It is Monday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for the Monday episode of the North Shore Drive by Brian Batko, our Steelers insider. Christopher Carter is still off, so you're again stuck with me in the chair today, breaking down the Eagles' Super Bowl victory against the Kansas City Chiefs, what the Steelers can learn from it, how far away the Steelers are from being able to do what the Eagles did. We're going to break it down by offense, defense, and then coaching. So those of you who have critiques of the coaching staff, make sure you're staying around for the third segment today. Brian, how are you?
I'm doing great. Carter, with all this vacation time, what's going on with him as I sit here after an entire week in Florida? So it was good. It was refreshing. And yeah, got home in time to watch the Super Bowl last night. And yeah, I mean, we have these same conversations every year. They just come in these segments of Steelers season ended in the first round of the playoffs or earlier. What went wrong? What do they need to do? And then the Super Bowl happens, and we talk about how far away are the Steelers? Pretty far. It's just it's kind of the capper to the very Groundhog's Day-ish Steelers existence at the moment.
Yes, in some ways, Brian, but also in other ways, I think it's starting with the franchise QB conversation, because I think we heard that from a lot of former Steelers. I think Rod Woodson was one of them down there talking about, well, the Steelers aren't going to be back on the stage until you have an all-time great at quarterback. And then you see Jalen Hurts, who I don't think a lot of people would perceive to be an all-time great. He's a good quarterback, but I don't know.
All-time great game last night, maybe. That was very impressive what he did.
Yeah, he played very well last night, but he's not Patrick Mahomes. He's not Lamar Jackson. He's not Josh Allen. And he played well enough for them to win. The Eagles defense dominated the Chiefs. Even though they didn't run the ball particularly efficiently, that's kind of been their bread and butter all year. Do you look at what the Eagles did last night as, the Steelers now lacking an excuse of not having that franchise quarterback, or do you think they possibly see it as a validation of what they're trying to do, of like, yes, you can win a Super Bowl running the ball and playing great defense?
I mean, maybe neither, but lean toward the second a little bit more, because I think more than this nebulous description of a franchise quarterback, which I think Jalen Hurts certainly is, but I agree with you to your point. Like, I don't know that he's in the elite tier of guys. You didn't mention Joe Burrow either. I would put him above Jalen Hurts. And now, I mean, with recency bias and the obsession with rings in sports talk culture, he might be number 5 on a lot of people's lists. And it's always one of those funny things of like, okay, is he a guy you can win the Super Bowl with? Well, yes, now he obviously is. And you look back to a year ago, is Brock Purdy that guy? You could argue he went to overtime in the Super Bowl, but he didn't make enough necessary plays to win the game. So people are going to come down on either side of that. What I look at more so in the quarterback conversation is I think the quarterback mobility component again comes up, not to sound like the broken record that is Mike Tomlin, but you look at Jalen Hurts and yeah, maybe he's not Lamar Jackson. He's not Michael Vick, and he's probably not even as straight line fast as Justin Fields. And I don't know that he's as slippery as a Jaden Daniels, but there's always that threat of him taking what the defense gives you on the ground. And you saw that at times last night. So I think it was on display in the biggest game of the season, but it's also just a function of what the Eagles offense is built around too. I mean, it was yet another season that he put up 600 plus rushing yards. He's done that all 4 years that he's been the primary starter in Philly. We know the rushing touchdowns are so inflated for him because of that brotherly shove when they get in close. But I think this is kind of another jelly bean in the scale for Justin Fields and going down that road again, or even just another quarterback who can really use his legs. So, I mean, that to me is certainly where the game is trending offensively. You look at all the teams that were there in the Final Four. They all had that ability. The outliers this year to some extent were Jared Goff, who was in just a ridiculously high-powered offense because a lot of the speed around him, the O-line, and maybe the best play caller going right now. And Ben Johnson, he just got a huge record-breaking, potentially coaching salary for a first-year guy from Chicago. And then Matthew Stafford is still kind of like that last gunslinger left from that previous era. But, the Rams didn't get as far this year either. So that to me is kind of my main takeaway, is that, yes, you can still win and win big with being a run-first identity, but you better have part of that be your quarterback, or I think your ceiling is pretty capped.
Well, I think that leads to the question of, if Justin Fields is the guy for the Steelers next year, Brian, can he play the way that Jalen Hurts did, not just last night, but this season? I think when he was the starter early in the season before Russell Wilson got healthy, people looked at his stat lines and said, well, you can't win throwing for 100 yards. But if you look through what Jalen Hurts did even in the second half of the season, 128 against the Rams, 131 against the Packers. Those were the two playoff victories. You go back into the season, he passed for 108 against Carolina, 118 against Baltimore, 179 against the Rams. Listen, it wasn't always easy. There was definitely criticism of that Eagles passing game throughout the season. There was some discord that we'll get into with A.J. Brown in a little bit.
They just need to give George Pickens a copy of Inner Excellence to read on the sideline, and I think that could be the grand fix for number 14. We've got all these discussions about what to do with George. Extend him, trade him, let him play out his deal. Just get him a copy of that A.J. Brown book, and all of your problems are solved.
Yes. I was gonna ask that question later on, but I'm glad you got it there. But we'll just talk a little bit more about Justin Fields in terms of. Do you think he can do what Jalen Hurts did? Is that his level of upside? No, he's not going to be Ben Roethlisberger for this franchise, but can he do what Jalen Hurts has done? Can he find that niche with this franchise?
I'm still one of the believers who think he can have that type of career. I think he has that in him. It's not that draft pedigree is everything, but Jalen Hurts was a second rounder. Fields was a first rounder. I mean, not every first round pick pans out. We certainly know that much. And Justin Fields might fall into the category of guys who went higher than they should have. But I tend to think there's still a chance, maybe even a decent chance, that he was part of a really doomed situation in Chicago over a couple different coaching staffs for a while there. And then, he comes to Pittsburgh, and it's a good reset, but it's kind of a wait and see approach because Russell Wilson is here too. Now I think year two, maybe there is an opportunity to kind of build your offense around him a little bit more and try to sort of go with this Eagles blueprint. Now we haven't even mentioned the O-line yet, which I think the Eagles are kind of far and away above what the Steelers are, building here. It's what they're trying to do, obviously, with the amount of draft picks that they're investing in that. But all of this, the Jalen Hurts using his legs to pick up first downs and touchdowns, the Saquon Barkley historic season. I mean, none of that happens without the guys up front, from left to right: Jordan Mailata, Landon Dickerson, Cam Jurgens, Mekhi Becton, who was a reclamation project. So it's not like these have all just been, high-priced, free agent pickups or, in the case of the Eagles, draft investments. And then Lane Johnson, who is a guy that they've, homegrown and kept paying him big bucks over the years. A lot of it's been development, from their O-line coach, Jeff Stoutland, who a lot of people think is the best in football. It's hard to argue with the results when you look at a guy like Becton go from a failed massive right tackle with the Jets, who was always hurt, to a dominant right guard with the Eagles, or Jordan Mailata, who was a dang rugby player, and they get him in the 7th round and mold him into a franchise left tackle. The Steelers were looking at a guy, I think, like Landon Dickerson coming out of Alabama a few years ago, maybe more so as a center than a guard, where he's thrived with the Eagles. And then Jurgens is just a case of a 2nd or 3rd rounder, I can't remember off the top of my head, who slides in seamlessly to fill for maybe the best center in franchise history, and Jason Kelsey. And look at him go. I saw a stat, if you were watching the game, I think they mentioned it late first, early second quarter, the biggest offensive line across the board in Super Bowl history. So there's something to be said for just having that size up front, but obviously they've done a great job developing and coaching up and using those guys correctly too. So it all works hand in hand. The quarterback, the running back, the O-line, and the skill players. The Eagles have paid a lot to have A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith on the outside as well.
Just a couple more questions on the quarterback, Brian.
My point is, it's great infrastructure for Jalen Hurts. And, I kind of hate doing the whole like, all right, if you put Justin Fields on this Eagles team, would they have won the Super? Like, it's an impossible hypothetical, but I get it when people want to bring those things up because it is such a cushy supporting cast around him. And again, I'm not taking anything away from him. He made some huge throws. That one to Devontae Smith couldn't have placed it in his hands any better. But clearly, this was a team that Hurts is thriving within rather than having to elevate a bunch of guys around him.
Well, there's got to be something, I think, between, a lot of times when a team wins a Super Bowl like this, Brian, they go down as the quote unquote game manager, which is kind of a disparaging comment. And I think the way he runs the ball and some of the plays he was able to make, a game manager doesn't make. He's a good quarterback. There's just some things he cannot do that some of these all-time greats can. But your point is, you build a good team around a good quarterback, and things like this can happen. And it doesn't always have to be one of those guys. And guess what? He has a ring. Lamar Jackson doesn't. Joe Burrow doesn't. Josh Allen doesn't. So I think that's, if you're a Steelers fan, you can be encouraged by that. Does that mean the Steelers are going to go out next year with Justin Fields and look like this? I don't think so. But at least the template is there, something toward that they can strive toward. You mentioned the AJ Brown situation. Do you draw hope if you're a Steelers fan from that listen, it wasn't all easy, but they figured things out? Or do you think George is in a different category, than AJ Brown, and maybe that situation can't be managed as well as Philadelphia did?
I have kind of looked at those two as parallels to some degree throughout this season. I mean, Arthur Smith himself, who coached AJ Brown as his offensive coordinator in Tennessee, when I asked him about Pickens after the Dallas game with the eye black and some of the antics that night, and things were not trending in a great direction for him on or off the field at that time, Arthur Smith said, you want guys who play with passion, and he brought up AJ Brown unsolicited and said that, or maybe it was after the bank. I don't know. I can't remember now. There were so many George whack-a-mole theatrics throughout the season that it's hard to keep track. But I do specifically remember Arthur Smith mentioning that at one point he thought AJ Brown was trying to win the Ray Guy Award with how often he was punting the ball into the stands after touchdown. So his point being that you do have to channel those big personalities at times, that it kind of more often than not comes with being the premier playmaker at that position. But I'd have to really go back and look at some of the, early AJ Brown years, if he was as headache-inducing as Pickens has been in 3 years. I mean, I think he was more productive by and large. And, he certainly has been in Philly. I think he's made more big plays, and he's been on more winning teams to this point than George Pickens has. So I hesitate, but I guess I would say that would be the platonic ideal, that you find a way to channel the talent and the passion into somebody who's still going to cause a little bit of drama here and there on the sidelines, and is not completely immune to the occasional blow up on a coach or a teammate, or a shouting match with a quarterback, but making sure that it's not obscuring the ultimate goal, and that he's kind of still hand in the pile for the team. And that is, I think, what Mike Tomlin's been trying to do for 3 seasons now. I just very much wonder if they're getting through to him. And I don't even think that the comments from Art Rooney II would indicate that there's a lot of optimism within the organization that they're getting through to him. And Brian, like AJ Brown could turn around tomorrow and go on first take and still be mad that he didn't get enough targets in the Super Bowl or something. I don't think that's going to happen. Yeah, but you never quite know.
You still have that ring, and that's all that I think really matters to a lot of the fans. And certainly, if you're a Steelers fan, getting that 7th Super Bowl. Last question on offense, Brian. Which piece of this offense that the Eagles have are the Steelers furthest from having themselves? You mentioned the dominant offensive line. Listen, the Steelers have some young guys that I think there's still some optimism about. The playmaking receivers, you're starting from a place of having George Pickens. There's just some questions there. We mentioned the quarterbacks, at the top of the show. Can Justin Fields replicate, Jalen Hurts and what he did? And then obviously there's the game-breaking running back that the Eagles have. Which piece are the Steelers the furthest from having themselves?
I'd say the offensive line, just because it takes so many things to fall into place. It's a 5-man unit, and you can't really have any weak links, and just Philly is so far and above most of the rest of the league. I mean, maybe you could put Detroit in there. A lot of people would have thought you could put Kansas City in there, but they didn't look like that last night. So I think quarterback, you can hit on a guy. Running back, you can hit on a guy. Even wide receiver, if the Steelers dip into the first round and find a way to keep George Pickens in-house, then suddenly you're talking about a pretty good duo. But O-line just takes so many pieces to fall into place that I'd probably put my finger on that one if I had to. But you could make a case for all of them, really.
Brian, we're going to get into the defense in the next segment. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's Edgar Snyder and Associates. Whether you're injured in a car accident or hurt on the job, Edgar Snyder and Associates has helped injury victims for over 40 years, recovering more than $2 billion on their behalf. If you or a loved one has been seriously injured in an accident, call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We are back on the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm Adam Bittner in for Christopher Carter. He is Brian Batko. We're talking about the Super Bowl and what the Steelers can take away from it and what they can learn from the Eagles' victory. And we're going to talk about the defensive side of the ball now, Brian. Is the difference between the Eagles and the Steelers defensively as simple as the Eagles had a bunch of bad dudes up front and that was, pretty key to them winning the game, or is it more nuanced than that?
Well, it's pretty tough to separate from what you just laid out there because, I look at what they were doing last night and, I think a lot of the discourse about this matchup going into the game was, Eagles are so stacked talent-wise, personnel-wise. Then you've got Steve Spagnuolo, kind of the evil genius for the Chiefs defense, and he's going to blitz you at just the right time. He's going to bring exotic looks and pressures that you're not expecting, and he's going to be one step ahead of Nick Sirianni and Kellen Moore. You saw traces of that early, and it just didn't hold up the way the Eagles' plan held up. And I think because of a big reason for that is because the margin of error is just so much bigger when you're able to do what the Eagles did and just rush for, get pressure with those guys. They're DNs and their D tackles, as opposed to if it were the Steelers, they're down linemen and they're outside linebackers. But they were able to do that, not have to blitz Patrick Mahomes where he can really burn you, drop so many guys into coverage. And, those young corners, Quinion Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, they really plastered on the back end. And Zach Bond kind of tying it all together as that ultimate inside linebacker, another great find for them this offseason. I think the Steelers are far away from that in terms of getting the dudes that you need, the Jalen Carters and Josh Sweats of the world. But it is a little bit of justification of their philosophy because so many emails I get from astute viewers and readers throughout the season, Adam, or why isn't Mike Tomlin blitzing more? Why isn't Terrell Austin blitzing more? What happened to Blitzburg? We need to heat up these quarterbacks. I understand where you're coming from, especially with the longtime philosophy of Steelers defense, but this is the vision for them is TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Cam Hayward, Keanu Benton. When one of those guys goes down, Larry Ogunjobi, Nick Herbig, we're going to win our one-on-one matchups up front, and we're going to get pressure on you with our front four and make it difficult to find holes in our coverage, either whether it's man or zone. And some of their best wins in recent years have come based off of that. I think back to beating Josh Allen and the Bills in the season opener, Joe Burrow and the Bengals in the season opener a couple years ago. So they have had success with that. But when you aren't getting home, then you're not nearly as successful in that because then the quarterback just has time to sit back there and bake a souffle or take off with his legs. So certainly see what they're trying to do, and I think a lot of teams are going to try to emulate what the Eagles have there. But man, you've got to hit on those pass rushers, interior, on the edge, and let's not overlook, again, what the Eagles have done draft-wise to get those guys. Jalen Carter, they kind of took a chance on him with the personal character issues and red flags coming out of Georgia, but he's been and he's had some moments on the field where he's whacking people in the face, and you wonder if it's going to implode. But he's such a good player as long as he's keeping his head on straight. And, again, Sweat is someone who wasn't really a huge name coming into this game. Well, he is now with the production that he just had. So it does, I think, probably speak to the people who are in the camp of draft a D lineman in the first round this year, maybe even the second round, or at least double dip at some point, because you saw what you can do when you hit on some of those dart throws.
Yeah, and I think they've focused so much of the energy on the offensive line the last couple of years, and obviously that's a big incomplete on how that's going to turn out. But the Andy Weidel regime, I mean, he was part of that, building this defensive line in Philly, and I wonder if he looked at that game last night and said that's where we need to go. We've invested up front on offense. Hopefully that blooms over time, and now we got to look toward the defensive line, start there, and then add pieces. So with that in mind, Brian, I mean, how many big additions can you imagine to that defensive line this season? Maybe one in the draft, one in free agency. Could it be, a third guy? I mean, how many different guys do you think the Steelers are going to try to throw into that mix going into 2025?
Yeah, I think one interesting aspect of it is this does seem to be a pretty deep D-line class in this draft. So, the Andy Weidel on one shoulder is telling you like, hey, we got to invest in the trenches and get stronger up front. Whereas Arthur Smith on your other shoulder is like, no, let's get a receiver first, because there's going to be good D linemen second, third, maybe even fourth round. So it wouldn't surprise me if they took two this year. I know Jerry Dulac's been pounding the table for them to replenish the pipeline on the D line for years now, and they've kind of danced around it. Keanu Benton really being the lone high round investment. They've kicked the tires on the DeMarvin Leals of the world. Maybe there's still some people holding out hope that he can blossom into that player, but it's getting late early for him. Isaiah Loudermilk really did not pan out, and that was someone that I think Kevin Colbert kind of stuck his neck out for when they traded away a future fourth to move up into that year's fifth round and take him because of his enticing blend of size at 6'7", 290, and coming.
And he had that 3-4 background too.
Right. Yeah, I was gonna say coming from that Wisconsin defense. So you kind of see what they were trying to do, but if you don't either, and it's also really hard to always tell. Is it a misevaluation or was it not a development by your coaching staff? I mean, that's all part of it. Like you look at someone like another guy who made a huge play last night, Milton Williams. I mean, I don't think anybody was really blown away when the Eagles picked him in I think it was the second or third round, but he's turned into a really productive NFL player rushing from the interior out of Louisiana Tech of all places. So I'm sure there was draft gurus out there who were calling him a sleeper, but it wasn't like taking Jalen Carter or Jordan Davis out of Georgia. He was more of an overlooked, under the radar type of guy. So you need to hit on some of them too, which brings me to answer your question. I mean, yeah, I think you probably have to look at the free agency market and see if anybody leaps out at you. But draft-wise, if you don't take one in the first round, you might have to take two of them and just see, hey, can you hit on one? Can you hit on both? That would obviously be great for the Steelers front. Regardless, though, you've got to start increasing the talent level there behind Cam Hayward, who's not going to play forever. He's kind of like Philly's Brandon Graham in this, analogy. So he's still around making a bunch of plays and anchoring things. You want Keanu Benton to take maybe that year 3 leap that he didn't quite get to in year 2, showed some more flashes, but people want more than flashes. They want consistent dominance up front from him, as a down lineman. I think Larry Ogunjobi's probably going to be out now. So, yeah, you're going to have some other answers for how you can, build out that defense and building it in that Eagles blueprint.
You mentioned Cooper DeJean and Quinion Mitchell. Those are two guys that we talked a lot about during the draft process.
Two guys I think the Steelers liked a lot too.
Yeah, so. they were definitely probably on that short list of guys that they could have taken, with that first round pick last season. Any regret if you're the Steelers seeing how things turned out with those guys for the Eagles?
I don't think so, because it would be a hindsight is 2020 thing to say they shouldn't have taken Troy Fautanu. I was very much on board with taking a tackle, and you can only draft so many players. We're talking about building a really good offensive line, building a really good defensive line, getting better skill position players, and now we're moving into the secondary. You want rookie of the year candidates and all pros at every spot, but that's simply not realistic or possible. The Eagles have done it kind of piece by piece, year by year, and that's why I voted Howie Roseman for Executive of the Year. I mean, yes, it takes into account only his work this past offseason, but what he's done in previous drafts allowed him to zero in on the secondary and take Quinyon Mitchell as an outside corner, Cooper DeJean as kind of a jack of all trades who's really settled in nicely to that slot role. So I didn't think the Steelers missed on those guys at the time, and I'm certainly not going to quibble with taking Zach Frazier, who might be your center for the next decade plus in the second round. But it does feel a little bit like a missed connection, and you can't predict how the draft board is going to go, certainly. And now they're going into a draft where I don't know if it's quite as strong at corner this year, but maybe they will find a gem in the third or fourth round who can pair with Joey Porter Jr. or maybe somebody like Corey Trice will eventually, the light will go on for him, both health-wise, which he really can't control, and then trickle down to his play on the field. So it just seems like, the Eagles are going to be a force to be reckoned with for a long time now defensively, because they had the conviction to double down on corners in the first two rounds and get two guys that I think, we were all high on as players, but just it wasn't really the right time or the right fit for the Steelers because they did have other needs.
Ryan, we are going to talk about the coaching staff on the other side of this break. I think a lot to take away from the Eagles' victory and how Nick Sirianni got them there. Before we do, just have a couple more sponsors to thank. This update is brought to you by Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci, mesothelioma and asbestos lawyers with over 85 years of experience. Call them now for a free consultation. Also have a message from our friends at Moon Honda.
We gave the all-electric Prologue EX class-leading passenger space. And we made its tech intuitive with Google built-in. Perhaps that's why we were named Best Overall EV and Hybrid Brand by Kelley Blue Book. It's nice when a dream comes together. Buy online, reserve from select dealers, or visit your local Honda dealer today.
We are back on the North Shore Drive podcast. I am Adam Bittner. He's Brian Batko. We're talking Steelers coaching staff in comparison to what the Eagles have. And Brian, it stuck out to me. I pulled up the announcement of Nick Sirianni's staff February 23rd last season. The Eagles welcomed 9 new coaches to their staff, both coordinators. Changed. Obviously, you go to Vic Fangio and Kellen Moore. But there was a lot of guys beyond that. They added, what do we have here? A passing game quarter defensive backs coach, a senior defensive assistant, defensive line, a cornerbacks coach, safeties coach, inside linebackers, quarterbacks, and then just an offensive assistant, returning to a staff that is substantially large too. I think they had like 15 guys coming back before you added those 9. It's just a completely different model from what Mike Tomlin has with the Steelers. So I wanted to get your reaction to that and the turnover that they had with that coaching staff and how that played into their victory.
Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to the story that I did right after the divisional round of the playoffs. I think it was looking at the Steelers' league low coaching staff size, which I know Art Rooney II says is not necessarily true, but to his point, I see what he's saying. It depends on who you count in that. Well, in what I've researched, I mean, I think when you count the most relevant on-field assistants, not strength and conditioning staff or administrative assistants, all of whom have important roles, but just the people who work most closely in developing and coaching the players and scheming up the game plans, the Steelers do lag behind a lot of the league. Now, not by dozens or half dozens, but 2 or 3 or 4, in some cases 5. I do think those bodies can make a difference. And, you mentioned all the positions that the Eagles have. I think they attract good coaches. I don't know how much of it is salary that they command versus the titles that they give them. I mean, they've got so many titles on their staff. I mean, associate head coach and passing game coordinator, assistant head coach for the running backs, run game coordinator, run game specialist. Like, that's just on the offensive side. Senior defensive assistant, as you mentioned, and a passing game coordinator. They've got a head coach for quality control, who I guess is like Nick Sirianni's right-hand man, who's making sure the coaches are coaching, the way they're supposed to, and in kind of a top-down approach. So I think it's admirable. They also we're not even getting into like the analytics, which they've long been at the forefront of the NFL, the way they operate there. So, I mean, I do think that that's an area where Philly's invested a little bit more. And, there's a bunch of teams with probably even more coaches than the Eagles who weren't even in the playoffs, let alone the Super Bowl. So it's far from a be-all, end-all. But, I mean, they seem to make hires that, are both better in quantity and, you talk about the quality. Vic Fangio is a failed head coach, yes, in Denver, but I mean, has plenty of respect around the league for his reputation as a defensive coordinator. And they kind of lucked into him in some ways because he made a lateral move from the Dolphins to the Eagles because he's from Eastern PA, wanted to be closer to family, kind of the reverse Mike Munchak, unfortunately, for the Steelers when you talk about coaching staff changes. But, they also made it somewhat of a bold move with Kellen Moore, who was, up and down in Dallas. And it seemed like sometimes fans were ready to promote him to head coach over Mike McCarthy. And other times they wanted to run him out of town. So, I mean, that's life as an offensive coordinator, but he's now going to springboard right into the head coaching job with the Saints after doing a really, kind of overhaul of what the Eagles were doing offensively this season. Doesn't hurt to have Saquon Barkley in that O-line in there as well, of course. But I mean, they have never been a franchise in Howie Roseman's tenure afraid of shaking up the staff from head coach to offensive coordinator to defensive coordinator. And I don't even think the guys that they got rid of were doing that poor of a job. Like Brian Johnson, their former OC, landed with Washington as their QB's coach, and he's going to get buzz, I think, to get another offensive coordinator or head coaching job this offseason if he hasn't, or next offseason if he hasn't already. So, I mean, they have hired really good people. They've trusted Nick Sirianni to some extent to keep this thing going down the road, because you look back a year ago and I think there were a lot of Eagles fans who would have signed in blood to get rid of Sirianni and hire Bill Belichick and move on. So, it is kind of it's an interesting case study in stability versus, change to move forward. And, the Eagles have made a lot of the right steps for sure. Some of it may be luck, but some of it a keen eye for what's going to work by their longtime GM.
One thing I did want to ask about specifically, Brian, was the run game and pass game coordinator positions. Because I think sometimes we've seen with the Steelers offensively, it doesn't look coordinated at times. And it does look like the success is predicated on the play calling. And I think that was true somewhat under Matt Canada, when I remember they had all those illegal man downfield penalties just not polished in that area. And then this season, I think the enduring image of that Baltimore playoff game was that viral clip of Broderick Jones, Dan Moore pulling into each other, just small disasters like that. Nothing crazy all the time. It's just, there's just small moments where this team does not look well coached. And I wonder if you have a coach that's focused on the coordinating and making sure that this play works correctly whenever Arthur Smith wants to go to it on the play sheet. If that's not a very specific area where the Steelers might be falling short.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all baked into it. And if Mike Tomlin were sitting here talking to you and answering that question instead of me, he'd probably say, we don't need fancy titles. I mean, Pat Meyer, our offensive line coach, sure, call him the run game coordinator if you want, because he has a really heavy hand in that. Or Carl Dunbar, our defensive line coach, call him the defensive run game coordinator if you want, because he takes on those meetings. Like, okay, I get that, but there are other teams that are stretching their coaches not as thin because they're supplementing with people who that's their entire job in a lot of cases. So, I'm not necessarily saying that is the Eagles, but yeah, they do have 3 or 4 more full-time on-field assistant coaches. And, I think more eyes just never really hurts. I know Mike Tomlin has kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but too many cooks in the kitchen are not necessarily good, or too many voices, I think is how he put it a couple years ago when asked about it. It's easier to keep everybody on one accord. My rebuttal, and I'm not trying to be haughty about it, he knows a lot more about coaching in the NFL than I do or ever will, but I just think more eyes can help coordinate a defense better. I mean, if you've got more hands working with the linebackers to make sure they're dropping exactly where they're supposed to, or more hands working with defensive linemen on their technique to win one-on-one matchups, I think you're going to, just have a better product in general. And you mentioned the offensive miscues that, like you said, those small disasters that add up. Look at all the defensive miscommunications. I mean, I know that's something that the players have kind of shouldered the blame themselves. Somebody like Patrick Queen as the defensive quarterback, or Minkah Fitzpatrick, who, says they need to be better on the back end as players. But I just have to think if you've got more people working with them, even if it's just one or two or three more, then you can be a little bit more sound and not have as many of those missed assignments and lapses. But, it sure doesn't seem like the Steelers are going to change their stance on that. And they're going to continue to try to do a little bit more with less. So, hey, it is what it is. If you have the Jimmies and Joes, the X's and O's become, I guess, a little bit of less concern. But, man, I would agree with you. I thought the Eagles looked very well coached last night. And, not to put down the Chiefs at all, just go back to the AFC title game. I think they won just as much with schematics and Steve Spagnuolo's blitzes on that fourth down as they did with the actual players that they had. Or even think back to the last Eagles-Chiefs Super Bowl. I know Patrick Mahomes was really good, but some of those touchdowns, those routes that were drawn up by Andy Reid, I mean, any quarterback in the league could have made those throws. He got people wide open, and to such a large degree, they won that game by him being a step ahead as a play caller. So I've always been one who thinks the players matter more than the coaches, but you certainly can't say it doesn't matter at all. It clearly does, and we see it time and time again on the biggest stage in the sport.
Yeah, but when you talk about development, though, Brian, I think that's also part of it too. Is having 30 coaches? Are you going to find that one play that's going to hit every single time by having more? I don't think that's necessarily true, but I do think in terms of getting these draft picks to pan out, to getting more depth out of your organization, having more guys focused on this player and saying, "Hey, I see this guy who might be getting lost in the shuffle of a smaller coaching staff. I can focus on him and work on developing him." And I'm sorry, the whole too many cooks comment from Mike Tomlin. Listen, that's part of why you make the money, Brian, is because he's got one of the biggest contracts in the NFL. Get more guys in there and coordinate them yourself as the head coach. Make sure they are all preaching your message. That's why you make the big bucks. So that doesn't hold a ton of water with me. Brian, any final thoughts on the Super Bowl before we sign off on this episode of the podcast?
Not really. I mean, I thought the commercials were pretty muted this year. Nothing really stood out to me. Granted, I was doing a lot of things during the commercials, so I
did you catch the Roman Law Group that local commercial that went after Mike Tomlin?
That wasn't really surprising to me. I'm actually surprised more local law firms or businesses haven't kind of tried to ride the wave of Mike Tomlin negativity for advertising and promotional purposes. But yeah, it was. I was having this conversation with it was a blowout, obviously, but it wasn't a blowout that was boring to watch, because I think there was a lot of catharsis for people who were so sick of seeing the Chiefs hoisting that trophy on the biggest stage, and Travis Kelce with his dumb hair hanging in front of his eyes, yelling out F-bombs and being annoying. I was just glad not to see that this year. And last thing I'll say, Nick Sirianni takes a lot of heat and a lot of crap from people, and with the Eagles and the way they go, if they go 7-10 next year, they might fire him. Who knows? But I think he actually did a pretty good job with this team this year. Save the yelling at his own fans when they barely beat the Browns, or bringing his kid up to the press conference to not have to face hard questions, as some people have speculated. But I thought they were a house of cards ready to crumble the week that the Steelers were going there because of the A.J. Brown, Jalen Hurts don't have a relationship comments by, was it Brandon Graham who said that on the radio show? And everybody's ready to burn it all down. I thought there was going to be some real dysfunction coming out of Philly, and it was looking bleak for Sirianni. And then younger brother of the longtime Washington and Jefferson D3 football head coach right here in Washington, PA, about 45 minutes south of Pittsburgh, your neck of the woods, Adam.
Yes.
He gets the ring, and he gets the Lombardi trophy, and gets the immediate post-game interview on the big stage. I thought that was pretty cool for someone who I think is a genuinely good guy. And, maybe he doesn't have the right head coach disposition all the time, but, and he got a lot of great players put around him by his GM, who is the biggest voice in that organization football-wise, but he didn't screw it up, so he'll always have that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Steelers fans who got the satisfaction of, they're also Penn State fans, get to see Saquon Barkley get his ring. And I thought it was an interesting game.
With Kenny Pickett, they got satisfaction, I think. A lot of them were spiking the football on the Steelers fans who came to hate KP8 by the end of it.
Yeah, and I think it was a game worth watching, too, because it was the Chiefs' ineptitude for so much of the game. That game was stunning. I mean, you were talking about, is this going to be the worst offensive performance in a Super Bowl in history? Deep into the fourth quarter before the garbage time yards and points started to pile up. But Brian, thanks for stopping by today. A lot more to talk about with the Steelers, so make sure you subscribe to the channel. Chris will be back Wednesday. Brian, anything you want to tease for Chip Tam and Football Tuesday?
I don't know. Maybe we'll start getting into some draft stuff. I mean, it's off season, full speed ahead now, or maybe we'll continue to sift through some Super Bowl storylines. We'll see what happens.
Stay tuned for that, and we will talk to you all again real soon. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.